The air in the Moonstone clearing was cool against Alara's skin, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. A full moon, impossibly bright, hung in the dark sky, casting the ancient oaks at the clearing's edge in shades of silver and black. Below her, the entire Silver Moon pack was gathered, their upturned faces a sea of pale ovals in the night. It was a familiar sight, a comforting one, yet her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed the front of her simple white dress, her fingers brushing against the silver locket that rested just above her heart. It felt warm from her skin, a constant, solid presence. Behind her on the great ceremonial rock, Reese Callan stood tall and straight. He was the future of the pack, the beta heir, and for 6 years he had been her future too. His hand rested on the small of her back, a possessive but gentle weight she had come to associate with safety. She glanced at him, at the handsome line of his jaw, and the way the moonlight caught the gold in his hair. He was looking out at the pack, a leader surveying his people. A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't quite reach his blue eyes. She told herself it was the gravity of the moment. Tonight was the final blessing of their union, the ceremony that would formally bind her to him before their official mating in the spring. Her gaze drifted to her father, Alaric Vance, standing near the front. He met her eyes and gave a small, proud nod. His own power as alpha was beginning to wane with age, and this union was meant to secure their family's legacy, merging their lineage with the strength of the beta line. Alara had always known her duty, but with Reese, it had never felt like a duty. It had felt like destiny. He had courted her with poetry and promises, with late-night walks along the creek and whispered plans for their future. He had seen her mind, she thought. He had praised her strategies for trade routes and patrol schedules, ideas she had given him in private, which he then presented to the council as his own. She never minded. His success was her success, their success. The locket felt heavier now. She remembered the day he gave it to her 2 years ago, on the anniversary of their betrothal. They were hidden away in a small, sun-dappled cove by the river. He had taken her hands, his eyes so sincere, and told her she was the anchor of his life. He said her intelligence was the sharpest blade in the pack's armory, and that together they would be unstoppable. He'd fastened the delicate silver chain around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. The locket was carved into a perfect crescent moon, their pack's symbol. Inside, he had promised, he had placed a tiny, folded note with a single word on it: forever. She had never opened it, wanting to preserve the perfect sentiment. A hush fell over the crowd as Reese raised his hand. The moment was here. Alara took a quiet, steadying breath, the scent of pine filling her lungs. This was it, the beginning of the rest of her life. She felt a tremor of pure joy, a warmth that spread from her chest all the way to her fingertips. She loved this man. She loved her pack, and she was ready to serve them both at his side. Reese began to speak, his voice smooth and clear, carrying easily across the silent clearing. "Brothers and sisters of the Silver Moon Pack," he said, "we gather tonight under the full moon, as we have for generations, to honor our traditions and to secure our future." His voice was everything she loved, calm and commanding. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His hand, however, slid from her back. The sudden absence of his touch was like a splash of icy water. She felt a flicker of confusion, a tiny dissonant note in the symphony of the evening. He took a half step away from her, creating a small but significant space between them on the flat granite stone. She looked at him, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. His eyes were fixed on the pack, his expression unreadable. "For years," he continued, his tone shifting subtly, becoming more formal, more detached, "I have been bound by a betrothal made in my youth, a promise made between families, born of old alliances and expectations." Alara's breath caught in her throat. A betrothal made in his youth. He said it as if it were an ancient artifact, something from another lifetime. They had only been 18, it was not so long ago. The pack murmured, a low, confused rumble. She could feel their collective uncertainty. Her own confusion was rapidly curdling into a cold, sharp dread. Her fingers went to the locket, clutching it tightly. "Times change," Reese declared, his voice gaining strength, taking on a hard political edge she had heard him use in council meetings. "Our pack faces new challenges. New threats require new alliances. We cannot be held back by sentimental ties that no longer serve the greater good. Sentimental ties. The word struck Alara like a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. This was not happening. It was a nightmare, a horrible, twisted joke. She looked at her father, whose proud expression had dissolved into one of stunned disbelief. He took a half step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak, but he seemed frozen. The silence in the clearing was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every eye was on her and Reese, watching this private nightmare unfold in the most public way imaginable. Therefore, Reese announced, his voice ringing with chilling finality, I stand before you all tonight to formally renounce my betrothal to Alara Vance. The world stopped. The moon, the trees, the faces below, they all blurred into a swirling vortex of gray and black. The only thing that was clear was Reese's face, cold and distant, as if he were discussing a treaty, not shattering her soul. He had not looked at her once. He had not given her the courtesy of a single glance as he dismantled their life, their love, their entire history in front of everyone they had ever known. He wasn't finished. The worst was yet to come. He turned his head slightly, and for the first time since he began speaking, his cold blue eyes met hers. There was no apology in them, no sadness. There was only a cool, dismissive calculation. The pack requires a strong beta female, he said, his voice dropping slightly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. But the words seemed to echo in the crushing silence. One who is suited to stand beside a leader, to bear strong heirs and to command respect through presence, not just through whispers in the shadows. Whispers in the shadows. He was talking about her advice, her strategies. The very things he had praised her for in private, he now used as a weapon to humiliate her. He was painting her as a schemer, a puppeteer, unfit for the light. He was erasing her worth, her contribution, her very essence, with a few carefully chosen venomous words. He was not just breaking their engagement, he was breaking her. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot knife twisting in her gut. She felt her knees weaken, a wave of nausea rolling through her. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over her, and she could feel the blood draining from her face. She stood there, frozen on the ceremonial rock, the symbol of her pack's unity, now the stage for her ultimate degradation. The pack was silent, their pity 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. They were not looking at him with condemnation. They were looking at her with sorrow, with discomfort. She was the problem to be managed, the awkwardness to be endured. Then, Reese delivered the final, devastating blow. To secure a new, vital alliance with the Stonecrest family, he proclaimed to the pack, his voice booming with renewed confidence. I am honored to announce my intention to mate with their eldest daughter, Lyra. A gasp went through the crowd. The Stonecrests were a powerful, ruthless faction, known for their brute strength and political ambition. An alliance with them would dramatically shift the balance of power within the pack, consolidating Reese's position and directly challenging her father's authority. It was a brilliant political move, cold, cruel, and brutally effective, and she was its price, the collateral damage in his ruthless climb to power. He stepped off the rock then, leaving her standing alone on the cold granite under the stark moonlight. She was a statue of shame, a monument to a broken promise. She watched him walk through the crowd, which parted for him like the sea. Some clapped him on the shoulder. Others nodded, their faces already showing their calculated approval. They were choosing their side. They were choosing the future. Alara could not move. She could not breathe. Her mind, the strategic mind that Reese had once claimed to admire, was frantically trying to process the variables, the consequences, the sheer scale of the betrayal. But all it could produce was a single repeating loop of his final words to her. Unsuited, whispers in the shadows. The locket she was still clutching felt like it was burning a hole through her skin. She wanted to rip it from her neck, to hurl it into the darkness. But her fingers would not obey. They were locked around the small silver moon, a final desperate anchor in a world that had just dissolved beneath her feet. Her eyes, blurred with tears she refused to let fall, scanned the crowd of faces that would not meet her gaze. Pity, discomfort, averted eyes. That was all that was left for her here. She felt utterly, completely alone. Her gaze drifted past the familiar faces of her pack, past the ancient oaks, to the very edge of the clearing where the shadows were deepest. And there she saw him, leaning against the trunk of a massive pine, separate from the Silver Moon pack, was a figure she recognized with a jolt of cold surprise. Damian Blackwood, the alpha of their historic rivals, the Blackwood pack. He was here as a diplomatic guest for the ceremony, a gesture of fragile, temporary peace between their territories. He was tall and powerfully built, a silhouette of sheer strength against the darkness. Even from this distance, she could feel the intensity of his stillness. He was not looking away. He was not whispering to a neighbor. He was watching her. His dark eyes were fixed on her, cutting through the 100 yards of open space. The moonlight caught the faint, pale line of a scar through his left eyebrow. His expression was not one of pity, like the others. It was not triumphant, like Reese's new allies. It was something else entirely. It was focused, assessing, and unreadable. Damian Blackwood, her pack's greatest enemy, was watching her devastation with an unnerving, intense consideration. And in that moment, Alara felt a different kind of chill, one that had nothing to do with shame or heartbreak, and everything to do with the unnerving gaze of the wolf at the edge of the forest. The world dissolved into a smear of motion and sound. Alara did not remember deciding to run. Her legs simply moved, carrying her away from the granite rock that had become her altar of sacrifice. The damp earth of the moonstone clearing was cold beneath her thin ceremonial shoes. Each step was a jolt, a physical punctuation to the silent scream trapped in her throat. She did not look back. She could not. To look back would be to see the hundreds of faces, the mix of pity, scorn, and morbid curiosity. To look back would be to confirm that this was real. Whispers followed her, slithering through the ancient oaks like unseen spirits. They were not words, not yet. They were the collective exhalation of a pack witnessing a seismic shift, a rustle of clothing, a shuffled foot, a choked-off gasp. These were the sounds of her life ending. Her vision tunneled until all she saw was the winding path leading away from the clearing, a dark ribbon disappearing into the deeper woods. Her lungs burned, not from the exertion, but from the effort of holding herself together. She felt like a vessel made of fine glass, struck by a hammer. The cracks were racing across her surface, and she knew if she stopped, if she took one full breath, she would shatter into 1,000 useless pieces. She passed packmates she had known since birth. Thomas, whose children she often watched. Sarah, with whom she had foraged for herbs just last week. Their eyes met hers for a fraction of a second before skittering away, finding a sudden, intense interest in a tree root or the evening sky. Their inability to look at her was a new kind of pain, sharper than outright hostility. It was the pain of erasure. She was no longer Alara Vance, the Alpha's daughter, the future Beta's mate, the Pack's hidden strategist. She was a ghost, an embarrassment to be avoided. Her mind, usually a fortress of logic and planning, was a ruin. It kept replaying Reese's voice, polishing the words until they gleamed with cruelty. A youthful mistake, politically unsuitable. The phrases circled like vultures. He had not said she was unloved. He had not said she was unkind. He had declared her strategically worthless. For Alara, who had spent years secretly drafting patrol routes and supply chain improvements and diplomatic overtures for her father, that single verdict was the most profound condemnation imaginable. He had taken her greatest strength, the mind she had dedicated to him and their pack, and branded it insufficient. The path opened up into the small cluster of dens that housed the Alpha's family. Hers was the smallest, tucked away under the boughs of a sprawling fir tree. It had always felt like a sanctuary, a quiet space for her thoughts. Now it felt like a burrow to crawl into and hide. The heavy oak door groaned as she pushed it open and slammed it shut behind her. The sound echoed in the sudden, crushing silence. She leaned her back against the wood, the rough grain pressing into her spine, and slid to the floor. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her chest, a solid block of ice pressing against her heart. Her home smelled of dried lavender, old paper, and beeswax, comforting scents that now felt like a mockery. Her gaze drifted across the room. A half-finished map of the Blackwood territory lay on her desk, notes in her precise script dotting the margins. Beside it, a stack of books on interpack trade laws. This was her world, a world of thought, of strategy, of seeing 10 moves ahead. And she had never seen this. She had analyzed the ambitions of rival alphas, the shifting loyalties of distant packs, the patterns of winter storms. But she had never once turned that analytical eye on the man who slept beside her, the man who held her future in his hands. The oversight was so colossal, so complete, that a hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from her throat. She swallowed it down, the taste of bile coating her tongue. How could she have been so blind? He had used her. For years, he had taken her strategies, presented them as his own at council, and reaped the rewards. He had praised her sharp mind in private, calling it his secret weapon. All the while, he must have been searching for a more visible, more politically potent alliance. Her value was in the shadows. His new bride, whoever she was, brought land, warriors, and a powerful family name. She brought visible, undeniable strength. Ilara had only brought a brilliant mind that no one else was allowed to see. A soft knock came at the door. It was so gentle she almost thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, hesitant and heavy. "Ilara?" Her father's voice. "Alaric Vance." The sound of it, thick with a pain that mirrored her own, finally broke the dam. A single hot tear traced a path down her cold cheek. She wiped it away with a furious, trembling hand. She did not want his pity. She did not want anyone's pity. She remained silent, hoping he would go away. The latch clicked. The alpha of the Silver Moon Pack had a key to every den. The door swung inward, revealing her father. He looked a decade older than he had that morning. The lines around his kind gray eyes were deeper, etched by a grief and fury he was trying to contain. The power that usually radiated from him, the quiet confidence of an alpha, was diminished, replaced by a weary stoop in his broad shoulders. He saw her on the floor, huddled against the door like a cornered animal, and his face crumpled. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice cracking. He took a step inside and closed the door behind him, sealing them in with their shared misery. He did not move to touch her, sensing perhaps that she would flinch away. He simply stood there, a great wounded bear of a man, his helplessness a suffocating presence in the small room. "It was a political move," Ilara said, her own voice a stranger's, thin and brittle. "A good one." The strategist in her could not help but analyze the blow, even as she bled from it. "He secures the loyalty of the Hawthorne faction. He isolates us. He shores up his claim as your successor." Alaric flinched as if she had struck him. "Do not talk like that. This is not a game of strategy, Ilara. This is your life. He dishonored you. He dishonored our family." "Dishonor is a luxury," she replied, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "Power is a necessity. He chose necessity." She finally looked up at him, her gray eyes, so like his own, holding a terrifying clarity. "You know this. You have made hard choices for this pack." "Never like this," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Never by savaging my own. He broke a sacred vow before the entire pack. He shamed you to advance himself." "That is not strength." "Gerardo." But they both knew the truth. In the brutal calculus of pack politics, results mattered more than methods. Reese had acted decisively. He had consolidated power. Many would see it as a sign of a strong, unsentimental leader, the kind the Silver Moon Pack needed as Alaric's own strength began to wane. The thought hung between them, unspoken and toxic. Her father was getting older. His leadership had been questioned more frequently in recent months. This public humiliation of his daughter, with no immediate retribution, would be seen as the ultimate proof of his weakness. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice flat. Alaric's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "He will answer for this. I am still the alpha of this pack." But the fire in his voice was banked. It lacked the roaring certainty it once held. Ilara saw the truth in the slump of his shoulders. Challenging Reese now would mean splitting the pack, inviting a civil war they could not afford, especially with rivals like the Blackwood Pack watching their every move. Reese had cornered him. He had used Ilara as a shield and a sword all at once. Any move her father made against him could now be framed as a personal vendetta, the emotional reaction of a slighted father, not the just action of an alpha. It was brilliant. It was vile. There is nothing to be done, Alara said, the words tasting like ash. Not now. He has already won this exchange. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints aching. Please, Father, I need to be alone. He looked like he wanted to argue, to wrap her in his arms and promise her that he would fix it, the way he did when she was a child and had fallen from a tree. But she was not a child anymore, and this was not a wound a bandage could heal. He saw the cold, hard wall in her eyes and knew he could not get through. With a final, sorrowful look, he nodded slowly. I am here, Alara, whatever you need. He left, closing the door softly behind him. The silence that returned was heavier this time, freighted with the grim political reality she had just voiced. She was not just a jilted lover. She was a casualty of a war for control of the pack. A war her family was losing. Driven by a morbid, self-destructive impulse, she walked to the single window at the back of her den. It overlooked a small rise, offering a partial view of the main commons where the celebration would now be taking place. It was a celebration she was supposed to be at the heart of, a party to honor her and Reese. Her final blessing. She could see it. The warm glow of dozens of lanterns cast a soft, dancing light against the dark trunks of the trees. The air carried the faint sounds of music. A lively tune played on a fiddle. And laughter. So much laughter. Dark shapes of pack members moved in and out of the light. She saw them raising mugs and toasts. And there, in the center of it all, was Reese. He stood tall and confident, his arm draped possessively around the waist of a woman Alara did not recognize. She was beautiful with fiery red hair that seemed to catch the lantern light and burn. She was laughing at something he said, her head tilted back, her hand resting on his chest. They were surrounded by the most influential members of the pack. The Hawthorns, of course, their patriarch clapping Reese on the back. The old guard who had always chafed under her father's leadership. Ambitious young wolves eager to align themselves with the rising power. It was a portrait of his triumph. Her ruin was the foundation of his victory party. She watched, her body numb, her mind cataloging every face she could make out in the shifting light. Every smile directed at Reese was a fresh betrayal. Every toast was another nail in her family's coffin. She had thought her heart was broken. But this was different. This was the cold, creeping horror of understanding the full scope of the game she had been a pawn in. The humiliation in the clearing was a single, brutal act. This celebration built upon her shame, was the true measure of his cruelty. He was not just moving on. He was dancing on her grave. A storm of emotions swirled inside her. The icy grief was still there, a frozen weight in her stomach. But now a new feeling was kindling. A low, dangerous heat that started in her belly and spread through her veins. It was rage, a pure, clean rage that burned away the fog of shock and self-pity. He had underestimated her. He had seen her as a quiet, useful tool to be discarded when a better one came along. He had deemed her unsuitable. He thought her meek. He thought her broken. Standing in the darkness, watching him bask in the glory of his treachery, Alara Vance felt the first flicker of a fire she thought had been extinguished forever. She finally turned away from the window. The image of his smiling face burned into her memory. Her movements were stiff, robotic. Her gaze fell upon her small wooden dresser. Lying there, gleaming faintly in the dim light filtering through the window, was the silver locket. A crescent moon, intricately carved. A betrothal gift from Reese, given to her 2 years ago on a summer night that now felt like a lifetime away. He had told her it was like her, quiet, beautiful, and holding the secrets of the night. Slowly she reached out and picked it up. The metal was cool and smooth against her skin, impossibly heavy. She remembered the warmth of his fingers as he had clasped it around her neck. She remembered the look in his eyes, the promise he had whispered against her ear. A future, a partnership, a life. And all of it was a lie, a well-crafted, long-running lie. Her fingers tightened around the delicate piece of silver. The sharp edges of the crescent moon dug into her palm, a small, grounding pain in the vast ocean of her hurt. She squeezed until her knuckles were white, until the metal felt like it would bend and break under the force of her grip. It was all she had left of that life, this hollow symbol of a broken promise. Alara stood there in the silent dark of her room, the distant sounds of her own wake just a faint murmur. She stared down at the locket, a knot of ice and fire tightening in her chest. The ice was the death of the woman she had been. The fire was the birth of something else entirely. The silence was the first betrayal of the day. It was a hollow, echoing thing that filled the space where the familiar summons should have been. For 6 years since she was 18, the call to the Alpha's council had been a constant in her life. A young warrior would knock, their voice respectful, and say, "Alpha's council, your father requests your presence." But this morning the sun streamed through her window, dust motes dancing in the light, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the pack waking up. There was no knock. Alara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands lying limp in her lap. The silver locket Reese had given her was on the nightstand, a cold circle of metal that seemed to absorb all the warmth in the room. She hadn't been able to bring herself to put it away. It felt like hiding evidence, like pretending the wound wasn't still open and bleeding. She traced the intricate crescent moon carving with her eyes, a shape that once promised a shared future, now just a marker of a life that had ended. Her fingers twitched with the memory of clutching it, the sharp edges digging into her palm. Now it just looked like a pretty, empty thing. She heard footsteps in the hall. Heavy, familiar, weary. Her father. Alara held her breath, her heart giving a painful lurch of hope. Perhaps he was coming to get her himself. Perhaps this was a quiet act of defiance, a small signal that she was still his counsel, his daughter, his blood. The footsteps slowed outside her door. She could almost feel his presence on the other side of the wood, a wall of indecision and sorrow. She imagined him raising his hand to knock, his knuckles hovering just inches from the surface. But the knock never came. After a long, agonizing moment, the footsteps resumed, moving away from her toward the council den. Alone, a deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. It was done. She was officially erased. Her mind, the mind that had charted patrol routes that saved 3 lives last winter, the mind that had negotiated the trade terms that kept their pack fed through the harshest drought in a decade, was no longer welcome. Reese had not only severed their betrothal, he had severed her from her own purpose. She was no longer Alara Vance, Alpha's counsel. She was just Alara, the discarded mate, a problem her father was now forced to manage by hiding her away. The feeling was worse than the public humiliation. The shame in the Moonstone clearing had been a hot, bright agony. This was a cold, creeping suffocation. She felt like a ghost haunting the hallways of her own home. She stood up, the movement stiff, and walked to her small window. It overlooked a part of the central clearing where pack life unfolded. Children were playing a chasing game, their laughter sharp and clear in the morning air. 2 elders sat on a bench, mending nets, their heads close together in conversation. Life was going on. The pack moved forward, its rhythm uninterrupted by her personal catastrophe. Or so it seemed. She had to get out. The small room felt like a tomb, the walls pressing in on her. She needed air that wasn't thick with pity and the ghost of her father's apology. Pulling on sturdy boots and a simple leather tunic, she avoided looking at her reflection. She knew what she would see. The shadows under her gray eyes, the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands she couldn't seem to stop. She looked like a victim, and she could not bear to see that person staring back at her. As she moved through the main den, she kept her head down, her dark hair falling forward like a curtain. But she couldn't block out the sounds. The whispers were everywhere. They followed her like flies, buzzing just at the edge of her hearing. Most people fell silent as she passed, their eyes skittering away. That was bad enough. The ones who didn't were worse. She was nearing the kitchens when she heard 2 voices, low and serious. They belonged to Thomas and Samuel, senior warriors who had served her father for 20 years. Men she had once admired, whose stories of bravery she had grown up with. They stood near the stone hearth, their backs to her, believing they were alone. Alaric didn't even put up a fight, Thomas said, his voice a low rumble of disappointment. He just let the boy sideline his own daughter. The pack sees it. He's getting old, Thomas, Samuel replied, his tone laced with a grim finality. His fire is banking. Reese's faction is gaining strength every day. This new alliance he's made seals it. Alaric should have seen it coming. Laura froze, her hand hovering over a water pitcher, Her blood ran cold. And the girl, Thomas continued, and Alara's stomach clenched. She was his sharpest weapon. Everyone knew she had the better mind for strategy. Now, Reese has made her a symbol of the Vance family's weakness. Every time the pack looks at her, they'll be reminded that our alpha couldn't even protect his own. A choked sound escaped Alara's throat. It was quiet, but in the sudden silence that followed, it sounded like a scream. The two warriors turned, their faces a mixture of shock and guilt. Samuel had the decency to look away, his gaze falling to the floor. But Thomas met her eyes, and in them, she saw it all. Pity, a hint of scorn, the cold, pragmatic assessment of a man who has already written off his leader. She didn't say a word. She turned and fled. She walked past the kitchens, past the training grounds, past every familiar face. Each averted gaze was a small stone thrown at her. Each whispered comment was another cut. They weren't just talking about her broken heart. They were diagnosing the death of her family's reign. And they were laying the blame at her feet. Her humiliation wasn't just personal. It was a political plague that was infecting her father, her family, their entire legacy. Her feet found the path leading away from the heart of the territory toward the wilder edges of their land. She walked without thinking, her body moving on pure instinct, a desperate need for escape propelling her forward. The manicured paths of the central settlement gave way to a rugged, overgrown trail. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and the sharp scent of pine needles crushed under her boots. The sounds of the pack faded behind her, replaced by the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the lonely call of a hawk circling high above. This was her land. She knew every stream, every ancient oak, every rocky outcrop. She had mapped this territory in her mind 100 times, planning patrols, identifying weaknesses, finding vantage points. This land was a part of her, an extension of her own bones. But today it felt alien. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like grasping fingers. The shadows seemed deeper, longer. She felt like an intruder, a stranger in the only home she had ever known. Her mind was a whirlwind. The strategist in her was screaming. This was a coup, plain and simple. Reese wasn't just marrying for power. He was systematically dismantling her father's authority. First, by publicly shaming his chosen heir, Alara. Second, by forging an alliance that her father could not counter. Third, by isolating her, removing her strategic mind from the council where it could have done the most good. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it was working. The emotional part of her was simply drowning. The image of Reese's face in the clearing, so handsome and so cruel, was burned into her memory. The way he had dismissed their years together, the love she thought they shared, as a youthful mistake. It was a lie. She had seen the calculation in his eyes. This was no mistake. It was a carefully planned execution, and she was the sacrifice. An hour passed, maybe more. Time had lost its shape. She was walking purely to put distance between herself and the suffocating den. Her legs ached and her lungs burned from the cold air, but she didn't stop. She needed to go somewhere the pity couldn't reach her. Somewhere she could just be. Not the broken mate, not the alpha's disgraced daughter, not the harbinger of her family's doom. Just Alara. Finally she heard it, the gentle, steady sound of running water. The creek, the natural boundary that separated the lands of the Silver Moon Pack from the territory of their historic rivals. The Blackwood Pack. She pushed through a final thicket of ferns and stepped onto the stony bank. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth gray stones. On the other side, the forest looked darker, the trees taller and more imposing. That was Obsidian Ridge territory, a land of sharp rocks and deep shadows. A place of legends and warnings, home to a pack led by an alpha known for his silence and his strength. Alara sank down onto a large, moss-covered boulder at the water's edge. She wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling them tight to her chest. Here, at the very edge of her world, the noise in her head began to quiet. The whispers of the pack were gone, carried away by the wind. The weight of their judgment that seemed to lift, just a little. There was only the sound of the creek, the sigh of the wind in the pines, and the steady, heavy beat of her own wounded heart. She stared across the water into the Blackwood territory. It was forbidden ground, a place of enemies. Yet, looking at it now, it didn't feel threatening. It just felt other, a different world, governed by different rules, a place where no one knew her name or her shame, a place where she was not a story of failure. For a fleeting moment, the thought was a relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. To be unknown, to be nothing but a stranger. She stayed there for a long time, watching the water flow, feeling the cold of the stone seep into her bones. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows through the trees. A chill crept into the air. She knew she should go back. She couldn't stay here forever. But the thought of returning to the den, to the pity and the whispers, was physically painful. She closed her eyes, just for a second, savoring the illusion of peace. A twig snapped. Her eyes flew open. The sound had come from the other side of the creek, across the border. Her body went rigid, every sense on high alert. Her hand instinctively moved to the small utility knife she always carried at her belt. She scanned the dark woods opposite her heart hammering against her ribs. A flicker of movement in the deep shadows between two ancient pines. Then it stepped into the dappled light of the late afternoon. It was a wolf, a massive one, larger than any she had ever seen in her own pack. Its fur was the color of jet, a deep uniform black that seemed to drink the light. It moved with a silent, deliberate grace, its powerful shoulders rolling with each step. This was no ordinary wolf. This was a creature of immense power, and it was not one of hers. It stopped at the edge of the water, directly across from her. It was only about 30 feet away, but the rushing creek between them felt like a vast chasm. The wolf simply stood there, its head raised, its gaze fixed on her. The eyes were not the yellow of a common wolf, they were a deep, intelligent brown, and they held her in a stare that was unnervingly still. There was no growl, no bared teeth, no aggression. There was just a quiet, potent assessment. It was watching her the way a chess master watches a piece on the board. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. She couldn't. She was mesmerized by the sheer presence of the animal. A strange calm settled over her fear. It felt as though the world had shrunk to this single stretch of water, to this one silent, unnerving confrontation. Then something impossible began to happen. A ripple moved through the wolf's powerful form, a shimmer in the air around it. It was not violent or grotesque. It was a fluid, controlled transformation. The dark fur seemed to melt away. The powerful muzzle shortened. The frame elongated and shifted upwards. Bones reshaped themselves with a faint, cracking sound that was swallowed by the noise of the creek. In the space of a few heartbeats, the great black wolf was gone. Standing in its place was a man. He was tall and powerfully built, dressed in dark, functional leathers that blended with the forest behind him. His black hair was unruly, and his face was stark and handsome. A faint, pale scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving his intense expression a permanent severity. He stood on his side of the border, making no move to cross, his dark brown eyes still fixed on her. Alara knew who he was. She had seen him from a distance at pack gatherings. She had seen him at the edge of the clearing the night her world fell apart, his face an unreadable mask. It was Damian Blackwood, the alpha of the Obsidian Ridge. The transition was seamless, a ripple in reality that stole the breath from Alara's lungs. Where a moment before stood a creature of fang and shadow, now stood a man. The air, already thin with the coming of evening, seemed to crystallize around him. Damian Blackwood. He was taller than she remembered from the rare, tense pack gatherings, his frame broader, filling the space between two ancient pines on the far side of the creek. The fading light caught the stark lines of his face, the severe set of his jaw, and the absolute stillness in his posture. Her heart, which had been a dull, aching drum for weeks, gave a single, violent kick against her ribs. Fear, sharp and primal, shot through her veins. This was not Silver Moon territory. The water gurgling over the smooth gray stones was the line. He was the alpha of the Blackwood pack, the historic rival, the shadow that loomed over every treaty and every border dispute her family had ever faced. His presence here was an act of aggression. It could mean nothing else. Instinct, honed by years of her father's training, took over. Her body moved before her mind could protest. Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, a subtle lowering of her center of gravity. Her right hand, seemingly casual, dropped to her hip, her fingers finding the familiar, worn leather of the knife she always carried. The hilt was cool and solid against her palm. It was a meager defense against an alpha, a child's toy against the storm, but it was hers. It was a declaration that she would not be taken easily. She would not be a victim huddled in the woods. He made no move to cross. The creek, no wider than a few paces, might as well have been a chasm. He simply stood, his hands loose at his sides, and watched her. And it was his gaze that truly terrified her, because it held none of the things she had come to expect. In the days following her public shaming, she had become a connoisseur of gazes. She knew the quick, averted glances of her former friends, their eyes clouded with a pity that felt like acid. She knew the triumphant, gloating stares of Reese's new inner circle, their smirks sharp and cruel. She knew the worried, helpless look in her own father's eyes, a look that broke her heart more than any other. Damian Blackwood's eyes held none of that. There was no pity, there was no scorn, there was no malice. There was only a calm, unnerving intensity. An assessment. He looked at her the way a master carpenter might examine a piece of rare, unworked wood, noting its grain, its density, its potential strengths and flaws. He was not looking at a woman. He was not looking at a rival's broken daughter. He was looking at something he was trying to understand, to measure. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind in the pines and the cold rush of the water over the rocks. Alara forced herself to breathe, slow and even. She would not show him the frantic tremor in her hands. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. Let him look. Let him see the defiance that was beginning to smolder beneath the ashes of her humiliation. Let him see that she was not yet extinguished. Her mind, her greatest asset, and her current tormentor began to work. She analyzed his position. He was deliberately respecting the border. This was not a physical invasion. It was something else. A message. A warning. What did he want? To gloat over the Silver Moon Pack's internal chaos? To test the defenses now that the Vance family's hold on power was so obviously fragile? Reese's betrayal had not just broken a betrothal, it had sent a tremor of instability through the entire pack structure. A weakness a rival like Damien would surely be able to smell on the wind. He was a predator, and her family was wounded. That was the simple, brutal truth of their world. Her presence here, alone and unguarded at the very edge of their territory, was a foolish mistake. It was an invitation to a wolf like him. She braced herself for the taunt, the verbal blow designed to twist the knife Reese had already buried in her back. She expected him to mock her father's weakness or her own fall from grace. But the words, when they finally came, were not what she expected. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, a low, calm resonance that seemed to cut through the chill air without effort. There is a cold front moving in from the north, he said. Alara's mind stalled. She blinked. He was talking about the weather. The alpha of the Blackwood pack had tracked her to the border, an act that could be interpreted as a prelude to war, only to comment on the temperature. It was so absurd, so completely out of context with the tension of the moment, that it disarmed her more effectively than any threat. She said nothing. Her fingers remained locked on the hilt of her knife, but the rigid set of her shoulders eased by a fraction. What game was this? Was he mocking her? Was this some strange, coded insult she was too slow to grasp? She searched his face for a hint of sarcasm, for a cruel twist of his lips, but his expression remained unchanged. He was perfectly serious. He held her gaze for one moment longer, a look that seemed to strip away all the layers of shame and grief and see the core of her, the strategist, the thinker. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod that was neither friendly nor hostile, he turned. He did not shift back into his wolf form. He simply walked away, his broad back disappearing between the dark trunks of the pines until the forest swallowed him completely. The clearing felt vast and empty without his presence. The oppressive weight of his attention was gone, and in its place was a swirling vortex of confusion. Alara stood frozen for a long time, listening to the creak in the wind, her hand still gripping her knife. The immediate heart-pounding fear began to recede, leaving behind a sediment of pure, unsettling bewilderment. He had not threatened her. He had not pitied her. He had not even spoken to her about what had happened. He had acknowledged her presence, made a simple, factual observation, and left. It was a clinical, detached interaction, devoid of the messy emotions that had been suffocating her for weeks. He had treated her not as a fragile, emotional creature, but as a sentinel at a border, as an equal. Slowly, she released her grip on the knife. Her fingers were stiff and cold. She walked to the edge of the creek, staring at the spot where he had stood. His footprints were faint on the damp earth and pine needles. He could have crossed. He could have threatened her, intimidated her, perhaps even harmed her. He was an alpha, and she was alone. The power imbalance was absolute, but he had not. He had respected the line. A strange thought began to form in her mind, sharp and clear as a shard of ice. Damian Blackwood was perhaps the most pragmatic, politically ruthless alpha on the continent. His every action was calculated. His every move served a purpose. He would not have come here for no reason. He would not have revealed himself simply to make small talk about an approaching cold front. The encounter was a move on a chessboard. It was a deliberate signal. He was showing her that he knew where she was. He was showing her that he was watching. But his gaze, it wasn't the look of a predator watching wounded prey. It was different. It was the look of a rival general studying a key piece on the board that had unexpectedly been left undefended. He wasn't looking at Alara Vance, the broken-hearted girl. He was looking at the mind that had planned the Silver Moon's trade routes, the strategist who had anticipated the rock slide that cut off the northern pass 2 winters ago, saving their hunters from a long, barren season. Reese had discarded her, calling her unsuitable, weak. The pack now saw her as a tragic figure, a ghost haunting the edges of their society. But Damian Blackwood, their greatest enemy, had looked at her and seen something else. He had not seen a victim. He had seen a weapon that had been foolishly dropped by his opponent. He saw a strategic asset. A tremor ran through her, but it was not from the cold. It was the first stirrings of something that felt dangerously like power. Her humiliation had been personal, intimate, and deeply painful. But his gaze had reframed it. For the first time, she saw it not just as a personal tragedy, but as a political blunder on Reese's part. And Damian Blackwood, from across the border, had seen the exact same thing. He wasn't looking at her like she was a broken thing to be pitied or crushed. He was looking at her like a rival, a piece on the board with its own value, its own agency. And the thought, cold and sharp and utterly devoid of sentiment, was the most empowering thing she had felt in a very long time. The fragile sense of empowerment Alara had found at the creek evaporated like morning mist. A new coldness had settled over the Silver Moon territory, one that had nothing to do with the coming winter. It was in the way pack members looked away from her father. It was in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she or Alaric entered a room. The political chill was far more biting than any wind that swept down from the mountains. It finally took shape during the next council meeting, held in the close air of the Alpha's den. Reese stood before the gathered elders, his stance relaxed, almost casual. But Alara, watching from the shadowed alcove reserved for the Alpha's family, knew better. Every line of his body was coiled with intent. He had chosen his moment with the precision of a hawk. He was not there to offer counsel. He was there to draw blood. He waited for Alaric to finish a dry report on grain storage before he spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet. "With all respect, Alpha," Reese began, the words a veneer of courtesy over a core of steel, "I must formally challenge the current decree on hunting rotations." A low murmur rippled through the den. This was not a minor point of order. The hunting rotations were an Alpha's prerogative, a system Alaric had managed for 20 years. To challenge it was to challenge his fundamental judgment. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She saw the strategy instantly. It was clever. It was cruel. It targeted the very heart of the pack's daily life, affecting every family and creating a public forum for dissent. It was a tactic they had once discussed in abstract, a way to destabilize a rival. Now he was using it on her father. Alaric looked at Reese, his gray eyes clouded with a weary disbelief. The rotations are balanced, Reese. They ensure all families have fair access and that the herds are not overhunted in any one sector. His voice was steady, but Alara saw the slight tremor in the hand that rested on the arm of his carved wooden chair. Balance for a pack of a different size, Reese countered smoothly. Our numbers have grown. The northern families feel the strain, while the southern territories remain plentiful. My proposal is simple. We reallocate the most fertile grounds based on pack contributions on the strength of the hunting parties. Alara's stomach clenched. Pack contributions. Strength, it was coded language. He meant his new allies, the families who had flocked to his side after he secured his new betrothal. He was proposing to reward his supporters and punish those still loyal to the Vance family. He was carving the pack in two, right before their eyes. Several of Reese's allies, seated near him, nodded in agreement. A large male named Thomas, whose daughter was now Reese's intended, spoke up. The boy has a point, Alaric. My hunters returned with half their usual yield last week. We need a system that rewards effort, not one that relies on old maps. The use of her father's first name, stripped of his title, was a deliberate insult. It hung in the air, thick and foul. Alara pressed her back against the cool stone wall of the alcove, her fingers digging into her own arms. She wanted to scream. She wanted to step out and dismantle Reese's argument piece by piece, expose his transparent power grab for what it was. She could list the ecological reasons for the rotations, the long-term health of the herds, the social cohesion it preserved. But she was no longer a voice on this council. She was a ghost, a disgraced daughter whose words would carry no weight. They would be dismissed as the bitter ramblings of a jilted woman. All eyes turned to her father. This was the moment. He needed to be the alpha. He needed to rise, his voice thundering with the authority of 2 decades of leadership. He needed to remind them who had kept them safe, who had guided them through harsh winters and territorial disputes. Alaric drew a breath to speak. The traditions have served us well, he started, but his voice was not the powerful command of an alpha. It was thin, strained. He sounded tired. He looked tired. The weight of Reese's betrayal, the public humiliation of his daughter, the sudden erosion of his power, it was all etched onto his face. He faltered, his gaze flicking for a moment to Alara, a flicker of pain and helplessness in his eyes. That single moment of hesitation was all Reese needed. It was a crack in the dam, and he immediately forced it wider. Tradition cannot feed our children, he said, his voice ringing with false piety. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the wavering members, the ones who smelled weakness and were ready to say with strength, I ask for a vote. Let the pack's leaders decide what is best for the pack's future. A vote. It was an unprecedented challenge, a direct assault. Alara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her father's authority was not something to be voted on. It simply was, or it had been. She watched as hands were raised, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Thomas, a few other elders from the northern territories. Then, one by one, others who saw the tide turning. They were not voting on hunting grounds. They were voting on leadership. They were voting on Alaric. The final count was a narrow victory for Reese. His challenge was upheld. The decree would be rewritten. A committee, led by Reese himself, would be formed to oversee it. He had won. He had taken a piece of her father's power and put it in his own pocket, and he had done it in front of everyone. Reese gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, a flash of triumph in his cold blue eyes. He glanced toward the alcove, and for a heartbeat, his gaze met Alara's. There was no remorse, only a cold, possessive victory, as if to say, see what I can do, see what you have lost. Alara turned away, unable to bear it. She slipped out of the den before the meeting was formally dismissed, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The cool evening air did nothing to calm the fire of her anger or the ice of her fear. She waited outside, pacing the damp earth under the ancient oaks until her father emerged. He looked smaller than he had an hour before. The proud set of his shoulders was gone, replaced by a deep slump. The lines around his eyes seemed to have carved themselves deeper into his skin. He saw her and tried to smile, a pathetic, broken thing. Alara, he said, his voice raspy. Father, she whispered, moving to his side. She didn't know what to say. I'm sorry felt hollow. We will fight them felt like a lie. He is gutting us piece by piece, Alaric said, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods. He's using the pack's own laws against me, the laws I taught him. He let out a dry, shuddering cough that shook his entire frame. Elara placed a hand on his arm. It was trembling. You need to rest, she said, her own voice tight with unshed tears. We will find a way. He shook his head slowly. He has the numbers, Elara. His new alliance, the promises he's making, they are more compelling than my history. He coughed again, a deeper, wetter sound this time. He pressed a hand to his chest, his breath catching. A spike of pure, cold fear shot through Elara, sharper than any humiliation she had felt. This was not just politics anymore. The stress, the constant pressure, the public dismantling of his life's work. It was physically breaking him. Rhys was not just trying to seize power. He was destroying her father in the process. He was killing him, slowly, with 1,000 cuts of procedure and protocol. The thought was so terrifying, so absolute, that it stole her breath. Her family was not just at risk of losing their status. They were at risk of being completely erased. Her father's health, their home, their very safety, it was all crumbling. Over the next few days, Alaric's condition worsened. He spent more time in his den, a persistent cough echoing through their home. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, the Alpha's authority seeming to drain from him with every passing hour. Elara brought him herbal teas and warm broths, her hands moving with a mechanical steadiness that belied the panic churning inside her. She felt utterly, desperately helpless. Every strategic thought she had, every countermove she could imagine, was useless. She had no voice, no power, no one to listen. She was sitting on the stone steps outside their den one evening, watching the sky bleed from orange to a deep, bruised purple. The air was still and cold. The sounds of the pack settling for the night were a distant murmur. She felt isolated, adrift in her own home. Her mind raced, cycling through impossible scenarios, dead-end strategies. There was no way out. Rhys had cornered them perfectly. They would be bled dry, their influence fading until her father was forced to step down in disgrace, or until his health failed completely. The cold fear for her family's safety had become a permanent resident in her heart. It was a constant, dull ache just beneath her ribs. It was in that moment of profound despair that she saw it, a movement at the edge of the trees that bordered their clearing. It was not the familiar shape of a silver moon wolf. This one was larger, its fur the color of night-dark stone, blending almost perfectly with the deepening shadows. It moved with a liquid grace, a confidence that was unnerving. It was not hunting. It was not lost. Its steps were measured, deliberate. Elara rose slowly to her feet, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she always carried at her belt. The wolf stopped just at the tree line, 100 feet from her. It was well within Silver Moon territory, a bold and dangerous trespass. But it showed no aggression. It simply stood there, its head high, its intelligent eyes fixed directly on her. The gaze was steady, without malice. Then she saw what it was carrying. Held gently but firmly in its powerful jaws was a small, rolled scroll, tied with a simple black cord and sealed with a drop of dark wax. It held it not like a prize, but like a delivery. A message. The wolf took 2 more deliberate steps forward, placed the scroll on the ground, and then looked at her one last time. It held her gaze for a long, silent moment before it turned and melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. Elara stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs. The clearing was empty again, but the silence felt different now. It was charged, filled with a terrifying, impossible question. She stared at the small, pale object lying on the dark earth. A lone wolf from the Blackwood pack had just appeared at the edge of her family's den, carrying a sealed scroll in its jaws. The wolf did not move. It stood at the edge of the woods bordering their den, a creature of shadow and stillness against the fading light. Its fur was the color of charcoal, its golden eyes fixed not on her father, Alaric, but directly on her. It carried a sealed scroll in its jaws, holding it with a delicacy that defied its powerful form. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through the air. Her father took a half-step forward, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of the knife he always wore, his posture stiff with a leader's protective anger. But the wolf's gaze remained on Alara, patient and unnervingly intelligent. It was a messenger, not a threat. She knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. Ignoring her father's low growl of warning, Alara moved past him. The damp evening air clung to her skin, carrying the scent of pine and the coming night. Each step felt heavy, a deliberate choice to walk toward the unknown instead of cowering from it. The wolf watched her approach, its head lowering slightly as she drew near. It made no sound. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against its coarse fur as she carefully took the scroll. The paper was thick, expensive, and sealed with a stamp of black wax she did not recognize. The moment the scroll was in her grasp, the wolf took a silent step back, turned, and vanished into the deepening gloom of the forest. It was gone as if it had never been there. Alara stood frozen for a long moment, the scroll a heavy weight in her hand. Her father came to her side, his worry a palpable force. "Alara, what is this? A trick? A threat?" His voice was a strained whisper. The authority he once commanded now frayed by stress and uncertainty. She did not answer. Instead, she led the way back into the warmth of their den, her mind a whirlwind of questions. The fire cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the familiar space feel strange and menacing. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. The wax crumbled, revealing a single sheet of parchment. On it, written in a strong, clear hand, was a single sentence. "Meet me at the border creek at dusk." There was no preamble, no explanation, just a command, or perhaps an invitation. Beneath the words was an emblem pressed into the paper itself, a stylized wolf's head formed from sharp geometric lines. It was the mark of the Blackwood Pack. It was Damien's mark. Dusk was already upon them. The last vestiges of sunlight were bleeding from the sky. He was waiting for her now. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A meeting. With him, the rival alpha who had watched her fall apart, the man whose presence on their lands was a constant, silent challenge. "You cannot go," Alaric said, his voice rough with fear. "It is a trap, daughter. He means to harm you, to use your pain against us. It is the perfect opportunity for him to strike." He was right. Every instinct of pack loyalty, of self-preservation, screamed that this was madness. To walk willingly to the border, to meet the leader of their historic rivals, was to invite disaster. It was a fool's errand, a lamb walking toward the wolf. But then, an image of the last council meeting flashed in her mind. She saw her father's face, pale and strained, as Rhys and his allies dismantled a decree he had held for a decade. She saw the smirks, the knowing glances. They were already being devoured, just slowly, piece by piece, from the inside. "What if it is not a trap?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "What if it is something else?" She looked at her father, at the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, and a cold, hard resolve began to form within her. Staying here, doing nothing, was a guaranteed path to ruin. Rhys would not stop until he had stripped her family of all power, all dignity. He would grind them into the dirt until they were nothing but a cautionary tale. This single line on a piece of paper, was the only unknown factor in a horribly predictable equation. It was a risk, yes, a terrible one, but it was also the first flicker of something that was not pity or scorn she had been offered in weeks. "He is our enemy, Alara," Alaric pleaded, his hands clenching at his sides. "For generations, the Blackwoods have been our rivals. They are hard and unforgiving. And what has our own pack been to me lately?" The words were out before she could stop them, laced with a bitterness that surprised even herself. The hurt was still a raw, open wound. "Rhys is not my enemy. He is my brother in this pack." Yet he did what he did. The pack watched him. They let him. She took a deep breath, pushing the pain down. "I have to know what he wants. Doing nothing is no longer an option for us, Father. We both know that." She saw the fight go out of him, replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching sadness. He knew she was right. They were cornered. She left him by the fire, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She did not take a weapon. That would be a useless gesture against an alpha like Damian Blackwood. Instead, she paused before the small wooden chest in her room and pulled out the silver locket Reese had given her. It felt cold against her skin. For a moment, she stared at the delicate crescent moon, a symbol of a promise that had turned to poison. With a sudden, decisive movement, she tucked it deep into her pocket. It was a reminder not of love, but of the cost of misplacing her trust. She would not make that mistake again. The walk to the border creek was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every tree, every shadow held a memory of a life that was no longer hers. Here was the ancient oak where she and Reese had carved their initials as children. There was the bend in the path where she had first learned to track, her father's praise a warm sun on her face. Now it all felt alien. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The air grew colder, sharper, the closer she got to the edge of their territory. The rich, loamy scent of the silver moon forest began to mingle with something else, something wilder. The smell of cold stone in high, lonely places. The smell of Blackwood land. Soon she heard the gentle, burbling sound of running water. The creek was the line. It had always been the line. A place of tense standoffs and carefully negotiated crossings for hunting parties. She pushed through a final thicket of ferns and stopped. The creek was no more than 10 feet across, a silver ribbon in the deep twilight, and on the other side, just as the scroll had promised, he was waiting. Damian Blackwood stood with his back to the dark, imposing pines of his own territory. He was not in wolf form. He was dressed simply in dark trousers and a tunic, his powerful frame relaxed but utterly still. He looked like he had been carved from the very rock and shadow of the obsidian ridge itself. He did not move as she approached, simply watched her with those intense, dark eyes. There was no one else with him. He had come alone. She stopped at the water's edge, her feet planted firmly on Silver Moon soil. The gurgling of the creek was the only sound between them. For a long, stretching moment, they just looked at each other across the divide. He was not smiling, nor was he frowning. His expression was one of calm, patient assessment. It was the same look he had given her at the creek before, the look that had so unsettled and intrigued her. It was the look of a predator studying not prey, but a rival. Finally he spoke. His voice was deep and calm, carrying easily across the water without being loud. "You came." It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact. "Your message did not leave much room for refusal," she countered, her voice steadier than she felt. Her insides were a knot of fear and adrenaline. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed his face. "A direct question deserves a direct answer. I find it saves time." He took a step closer to his side of the bank, the movement fluid and deliberate. "I did not bring you here to offer condolences, Alara. Pity is an insult to someone like you." Her breath caught in her throat. He had spoken her name. He had not called her Vance's daughter or the Beta's former mate. He had called her Alara, and his dismissal of pity struck a chord deep within her. It was the one emotion she could not bear, the one that made her feel small and broken. "Then why am I here, Alpha Blackwood?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. He was silent for another moment, his eyes searching her face. "A year ago," he began, his tone measured, "your pack was having trouble with rogue wolves encroaching on your eastern hunting grounds. Your patrols were predictable. They were losing kills and becoming frustrated." Alara froze. She remembered it perfectly. It was a minor but persistent problem that was wearing on pack morale. "Your council debated for weeks," Damien continued, his voice never wavering. "Most wanted to send a war party, to meet force with force. A loud, aggressive, and ultimately foolish response. It would have left your other borders vulnerable." She remembered that too. Reese had been the loudest voice in favor of a full assault. He had called any other approach weak. She had stayed silent in the main council, as was expected of her, but later that night she had spoken to her father. She had laid out a different plan, a quieter, more intricate strategy. As if he were reading her mind, Damien said, "But a different strategy was proposed. Not in the council, but in private. A plan to pull back the main patrols for 3 days. To feign weakness. To let the rogues grow bold and push deeper into your territory, all the while tracking them from a distance. You would let them corner themselves in the Stonefall Canyon, using a small, fast party to close the only escape route once they were inside. No major fight, just containment. A trap sprung not with muscle, but with intelligence. The world seemed to fall away. Alara could not breathe. No one was supposed to know the details of that plan. She had told only her father, Raphael. Alaric had presented a watered-down version to the council, but Rhys had mocked it openly. He had called it a coward's gambit. He had convinced the elders that a show of strength was the only way to maintain respect. Her plan was discarded. Her father had come back to her that night, his face a mask of apology and defeat. It was one of the first times she had truly understood the limits of his waning power. How? The word was a choked whisper. How could you possibly know that? Damien's gaze never left hers. It was intense, burning with a frightening clarity. Because I was watching, he said simply. I watch all my rivals. When your patrols did not change, I assumed the plan had been dismissed. Your pack spent another month chasing shadows on the eastern border. You lost more territory than you should have. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. It was a brilliant strategy, Alara. Ruthlessly efficient. It used your opponent's aggression against them. It was a plan I would have been proud to call my own. But your pack's future alpha laughed at it. He could not see its value because he did not have the mind to conceive of it himself. A tremor went through her. It started in her hands and spread through her entire body. All this time, she had been the architect of her pack's small victories, the silent strategist behind her father's reign, and she had been dismissed, ignored, laughed at, and here, standing on the other side of a stream, was her greatest enemy, reciting her own secret plans back to her. He had not just seen her, he had understood her. The validation was so sharp, so unexpected, it felt like a physical blow. Tears pricked at the backs of her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a fierce, painful, and overwhelming vindication. He saw the sheen in her eyes, but his expression did not soften. It sharpened. He took another step, his boots now at the very edge of the water. The last light of day caught the faint scar through his eyebrow, making it stand out against his dark features. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not an enemy, but a man who recognized a kindred spirit in the art of power. He looked at her and said, Rhys didn't discard a mate. He discarded his pack's greatest weapon. A mistake I do not intend to make. The words hung in the cold air, more real than the mist rising from the creek. A mistake I do not intend to make. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to shrink, the scent of damp earth and pine fading into nothing. All that existed was the space between her and Damien Blackwood, the rival alpha. He stood on his side of the water, a solid, unmoving silhouette against the dying light. His gaze held hers, and it was a look devoid of pity, of condescension. It was a look of pure, sharp assessment. For the first time since the ceremony, she felt something other than shame. She felt seen. Her mind, a chaotic storm for weeks, went unnervingly still. She was a strategist. She analyzed threats and opportunities. But this, him, it was a variable she had never once considered. Her voice was a dry whisper when she finally found it. What do you want, Blackwood? The name was an accusation, a shield. He was the enemy, the leader of a pack that had been their rivals for generations. His presence here was a violation of every known rule. Damien did not move closer. He remained on his land, respecting the invisible line that divided their worlds. I want to make you an offer, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to travel through the ground itself. It was calm, measured, holding no trace of deceit she could detect. An offer for you, and through you, for your family. Alara's fingers curled into fists at her sides. A bitter laugh almost escaped her. An offer. The last offer she'd received had ended with her life in ruins, her name whispered in scorn throughout her own home. I am not in the market for offers, she said, her tone as cold as the creek water flowing between them. She had nothing left to give, nothing left to trade. Rhys had made sure of that. I am aware, Damien replied, his patience a force of nature. You believe you have nothing. You are wrong. He took a single, deliberate step closer to the water's edge. his boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. Reese is not simply celebrating a new betrothal. He is consolidating power. Every day he peels away another of your father's allies. He uses his new connection to challenge Alaric's authority, making him appear weak, indecisive. Every word was a cold, hard stone striking her chest. It was the truth. It was the secret, terrifying reality she watched unfold from the shadows of her own home. The reality her father was trying desperately to fight, growing more tired with each passing day. The hunting rotations were just the beginning, Damien continued, his eyes never leaving hers. Soon he will make a direct challenge for the alpha position. His faction has the numbers. They have the momentum. When he succeeds, and he will succeed, what do you think happens to the Vance family? To the old alpha who was deemed too weak to lead? To his daughter, the publicly discarded mate? The unspoken answer chilled her to the bone. They would be cast out, stripped of their rank, their home, their protection. They would become nothing, ghosts in a territory that was once theirs. Or worse, they would be made a permanent, living example of failure. A fate worse than being exiled. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp with fury and fear. "Why are you telling me this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "To gloat? To enjoy the fall of the House of Vance from a front row seat?" "No," he said, his intensity deepening. "I am telling you this because I am offering you a way to stop it. I am offering you sanctuary." The word hit her with the force of a physical blow. Sanctuary. The concept was so foreign, so impossible, it didn't compute. "In the Blackwood Pack?" she scoffed, the sound incredulous. "You want me to run to my enemy for protection? That is your grand offer? To become a refugee? A charity case for a rival alpha to parade around as a trophy?" The humiliation of it burned through her. Damien's expression remained unchanged, but a new hardness entered his voice. "I do not deal in charity, Alara, and I have no interest in trophies." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the space between them. "I am offering you a position, a formal title, Alpha's Counsel, my chief strategist. Your mind, your insights, would guide the Blackwood Pack, our defenses, our trade agreements, our long-term survival. Your voice would be heard and respected in my council." Alara stared at him, her mind completely blank. It was like trying to read a map in a language she had never seen. Alpha's Council, a position of immense power and trust. He was talking about giving her, an outsider, a voice at the very heart of his pack. It was madness. No alpha would ever do such a thing. Trust was earned over a lifetime, not offered to a rival across a stream. She searched his face for the trick, the lie, the hidden barb in this beautiful, impossible proposition. "Why?" It was the only word she could form. "Why would you do that? What do you gain from this?" "I gain a weapon," he answered without hesitation. "The one Reese was foolish enough to throw away. I told you, I watched you. I know it was your strategy that saved the Silver Moon Pack from the famine 3 winters ago, when you rerouted the elk herds. I know it was your plan that secured the southern border when the rogue packs pressed in last spring. Your father took the credit, but the thinking, the pattern, it was not his, it was yours. Your mind is a greater asset than any warrior." Her heart hammered against her ribs. He knew all this time, while she had been a ghost in her own pack's council, celebrated in private by her father but erased in public. Damien Blackwood had been watching. He had seen her work, recognized her signature, and valued it. The validation was so potent, so unexpected, it almost brought her to her knees. He saw the shock on her face, the internal war raging within her. He pressed his advantage, his voice low and persuasive. "This is the arrangement. You give me your loyalty, and you give me your strategic mind. In return, I give you my protection. Not just for you, but for your entire family." Alara's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "I mean a formal alliance," he stated plainly. "Blackwood and Vance. As long as you serve as my counsel, my pack will guarantee the integrity of your family's land and standing. My warriors will be a shield for your father. Rhys Callan will not dare move against Alaric with the Blackwood pack standing behind him. His ambition is great, but he is not suicidal. He will not risk a war on two fronts. She felt the world tilt. He was offering to save them. He was offering her the one thing she wanted more than anything in the world: the safety of her father, the preservation of her family's honor. But the price was her life as she knew it. It meant leaving the Silver Moon pack. It meant abandoning her home, the only place she had ever known. It meant placing her trust in this man, this powerful, enigmatic rival who saw her not as a broken woman, but as a tool of war. Her thoughts raced, tumbling over one another. A trap. It had to be a trap. And yet, his logic was flawless. The political advantage for him was clear. He would neutralize a rival pack not through war, but by acquiring its greatest strategic asset, her. He would bind the Vance family to him, creating a powerful buffer state and securing his own borders. It was a brilliant, ruthless, and utterly pragmatic move. It was exactly the kind of move she would have made. A shiver ran through her, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. For weeks she had been drowning in the past, trapped by what Rhys had done to her. Damien was not offering to help her swim. He was offering to pull her onto a different ship entirely, a warship, and hand her the navigation charts. A final terrible thought surfaced, coded in the cynical lessons she had learned about the world of pack politics. A powerful alpha does not simply give a position of this magnitude to an unmarried woman without other expectations. It was the oldest play in the book, a political marriage, cloaked in the language of strategy. Her stomach twisted. She looked at him, forcing herself to ask the question that would define everything. "And this position, as your counsel, does it come with other duties? Would you expect me to become your mate?" The words tasted like ash. To trade one cage for another, no matter how gilded, was not freedom. Damien's dark eyes held hers. For a long moment he was silent, and in that silence, Alara prepared herself for the inevitable answer. The confirmation that this too was just another transaction of the flesh. But when he spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting through her assumptions with absolute clarity. "No." The word was final. "That is not the offer. Rhys offered you a place in his bed and called it love. He wanted a pretty symbol to stand beside him. Your body, your bloodline. That is not what I value in you." He took a half step back from the water's edge, creating a small but significant distance between them. The gesture was one of respect, of clear boundaries. "I am not offering you merit," he said, his voice resonating with a power that had nothing to do with romance. "I am not offering you a place in my life as a mate. I am offering you a seat at my side in power. Your worth to me is in your mind. The rest is irrelevant." Alara stood frozen on the bank of the creek, the sound of the rushing water filling the sudden silence. Speechless, the ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, as if the entire landscape of her world had just been redrawn. He wasn't offering her a heart or a home in the traditional sense. He was offering her a throne of her own. She began to tremble, not from the cold, but from the terrifying, earth-shattering weight of the decision he had just laid at her feet. The night air was cold, but Alara's room felt suffocating, a box filled with the ghosts of a life that no longer belonged to her. For hours she had paced the worn wooden floor, a restless, caged thing. In her right hand she clutched the silver locket Rhys had given her. The metal was smooth and cold, a dead weight against her palm. It was a promise that had turned to poison, a memory that burned like frost. Her fingers tightened around it, the sharp edges of the crescent moon digging into her skin, a small, grounding pain. In her mind, another voice echoed, deep and steady, cutting through the chaos. Damien Blackwood's words. A seat at his side in power. Not a mate, not a consolation prize. A weapon. She stopped at the window, staring out into the darkness of the Silver Moon territory. Her home. Every tree, every shadow, every scent of pine and damp earth was woven into her soul. How could she leave it? The thought was a physical blow, winding her, making her lean against the cool glass. But what was left for her here? Pitying glances, whispers behind cupped hands, the slow, agonizing decay of her family's legacy. She saw her father's face in her mind's eye, the lines of strain deepening with each passing day. His shoulders stooped under the weight of Reese's relentless ambition. Staying meant watching him break. It meant watching everything her ancestors had built crumble into dust, all because his daughter had been deemed unworthy. The two choices warred within her, a silent, brutal conflict. One hand held the symbol of her humiliation. The other, metaphorically, held an offer of impossible salvation from a historic enemy. To remain was to be a victim, a constant reminder of her pack's weakness. To leave was to be a traitor, abandoning her people for a rival. Yet Damien's offer wasn't about betrayal, it was about strategy. It was about survival. And as the first hint of gray dawn touched the horizon, a terrible cold clarity began to settle in her heart. Loyalty wasn't about staying put, it was about protecting what you loved, no matter the cost. She unclenched her fist, the silver locket falling onto her nightstand with a soft, final clink. The decision was made. Now she had to face her father. Alaric Vance was in a study, a room that had always smelled of old leather and drying ink. Now it just smelled tired. He sat at his large oak desk, not reading the scrolls of pack law before him, but staring at them as if they were written in a foreign language. He looked up as Alara entered, and the hope that flared in his eyes for a split second was quickly extinguished by the grim resolve on her face. He had aged a decade in the last few weeks. The strong alpha who had taught her to track and fight looked like a man waiting for an execution. Alara's heart ached for him. She closed the heavy door behind her, the sound echoing the finality of her purpose. She did not waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room with unnerving steadiness. "Father, I need to tell you something." Alaric straightened, his instincts sensing the gravity of her tone. She walked to the desk but did not sit. She stood before him, as if making a formal report to her alpha. "I met with Damien Blackwood." The name hung in the air between them, thick and dangerous. Alaric's face hardened instantly. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, protective fury. "What did he want? If that cur laid a hand on you—" "He did not," Alara interrupted, her voice firm. "He was respectful." She saw the disbelief warring with concern in her father's eyes. "He made me an offer." Alaric's hands curled into fists on the desk. "An offer? To what end? To mock us further? To use our family's shame against us?" His voice rose, filled with the pain and helplessness she had been dreading. "Tell me, Alara, what price did he ask for his pity?" The word pity struck her, but it no longer had the power to wound. Damien had not offered her pity. He had offered her a sword. "He offered me a position," she said, her gaze unwavering. "He wants me to be his alpha's counsel, his chief strategist." The room fell silent. Alaric stared at her, his anger draining away, replaced by profound confusion. He blinked slowly, as if trying to process an impossible equation. His strategist? She saw the gears turning in his mind. He, more than anyone, knew what she was capable of. He had seen her plans, her insights, the strategies she had laid out for him over the years, many of which he had used to secure their borders and prosperity. He also knew which ones he had ignored, to his own detriment. "He knew about the plan for the northern ridge," Alara added softly. "The one I proposed last year. The one you said was too aggressive." Alaric flinched as if struck. He remembered he had dismissed her idea to fortify the ridge against encroachment, favoring a more diplomatic approach that had ultimately failed, costing them valuable hunting ground. Blackwood, their rival, had not only noticed their failure, but had correctly identified its source, a brilliant strategy that was never implemented. Damien hadn't just seen Alara's value, he had understood it on a tactical level that no one else had. The fury in Alaric's eyes was replaced by something far more devastating. Shame. He had failed her, not just as a father, but as an alpha. He had possessed the sharpest mind in the pack and had let it gather dust out of caution and tradition. "He offers an alliance," Alara continued, pressing her advantage now that the shock had settled. "In return for my service, he will formally recognize our family's authority. He will shield us. Reese will not be able to touch you. Our lands will be protected." She laid it all out, the cold, hard facts of the proposal. It was a political masterstroke, an unthinkable pact between wolves who had been rivals for generations. It was also their only hope. Alaric leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked past Alara, his gaze distant. "An alliance with the Blackwood Pack," he murmured, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Our ancestors would turn in their graves." "Our ancestors are not the ones facing ruin, Father," Alara said, her voice softening with a pain that mirrored his own. This was the hardest part, the betrayal of history, of identity. This is not about them. This is about our survival. It is about ensuring there is a Silver Moon Pack for future generations to lead. He finally met her eyes, and she saw the truth of their situation reflected there. The pride of an alpha was a powerful thing, but the love of a father was stronger. He saw the path she was offering, a narrow, treacherous bridge over a chasm of oblivion, and it required him to let his daughter walk into the heart of his enemy's territory. "He would be a fool not to want you," Alaric said, his voice thick with emotion. It was both a compliment and a confession of his own foolishness. "You're mine. It was always your greatest strength." He looked down at his own hands, the hands of a leader who could no longer lead. "I could not protect you from Reese. I cannot protect this family from what he is doing." He exhaled a long, ragged breath of surrender. To accept his offer, you would have to leave. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a quiet acknowledgement of the sacrifice. Alara felt a tear escape and trace a cold path down her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. "I know," she whispered, "but if I stay, I will be forced to watch him destroy you. I cannot do that. My place is where I can best protect my family, even if that place is on Obsidian Ridge." A heavy silence settled between them, a shared grief for the home she would lose. Alaric slowly nodded, not with enthusiasm, but with the grim acceptance of a general sending his best soldier on a perilous mission. He was giving her his blessing, not just to go, but to do what needed to be done. He was trusting her strategy one last time. The weight of his trust was both a burden and a relief. She had her answer. The path was set. She gave her father a small, sad smile and turned to leave, her heart a tangled knot of sorrow and resolve. She had to prepare. She had to sever the final ties. Walking out of the den, the familiar air of the pack lands felt different, alien. Every scent, every sound was a farewell. She was already a ghost here, haunting the edges of a life she was about to leave behind. Her steps were firm as she walked, not back to her room, but toward the council den. It was the center of power, the place where Reese was systematically dismantling her father's world. She wasn't sure what she intended to do, only that she couldn't stand to hide any longer. She needed to see the battlefield one last time before she switched sides. As she rounded the great oak that marked the entrance to the council clearing, a figure stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. It was Reese. His usual charming smile was gone, replaced by a chillingly unfamiliar expression. The warmth in his blue eyes had frozen over, leaving nothing but cold, possessive ice. Rumors traveled fast in a pack, but this was more than that. This was the reaction of a man who felt his property was trying to escape. As she's walking near the council den, Reese intercepts her, his expression a mask of fury and possession. The air near the council den was heavy with the scent of old wood and burning pine. Alara had been walking with her head down, lost in the chaotic storm of her own thoughts, when a shadow fell across her path. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. Reese stood before her, blocking her way. His face, usually a canvas of easy charisma, was twisted into a mask of something she had never seen directed at her before. It was a raw, ugly mixture of fury and possession. His blue eyes, which once held a universe of promises, were now narrowed into cold, hard chips of ice. The muscles in his jaw were clenched so tightly she could see them working under his skin. He took a step forward, closing the small distance she had instinctively tried to keep between them. Before she could react, his hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm. The grip was not just firm, it was bruising. It was a brand of ownership. A shock of pain and violation shot through her, so sharp and sudden it momentarily silenced the frantic debate in her mind. His heat seeped through the thin fabric of her sleeve, a warmth that felt sickeningly wrong. She froze, her entire body going rigid. The world seemed to shrink to the point of his fingers digging into her flesh in the furious look on his face. He leaned in, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was nothing like the smooth, persuasive tones he used in public. "Where have you been?" he hissed, the words a demand, not a question. "I've heard things, Alara. Whispers about you and Blackwood. At the creek." He gave her arm a slight shake, as if to rattle the truth out of her. "Do you think I'm a fool? Do you think you can sneak around behind my back in my own territory?" His territory. The words echoed in the sudden, silent chamber of her mind. He spoke as if he were already alpha. He spoke as if she were a piece of property that had wandered out of its designated pen. The pain in her arm was a dull throb, a physical anchor to the surreal horror of the moment. Her gaze remained locked on his, but she was no longer just seeing him. She was seeing through him. She saw the panicked insecurity flickering behind the rage. This was not the anger of a betrayed lover. This was the fury of a man whose prized possession was being admired by another. Damien had seen value in what Reese had so publicly discarded, and Reese could not stand it. "You belong to the Silver Moon Pack," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a threat that made her stomach clench. "And you belong to me. You always have. Do not forget that." The sheer audacity of his claim was breathtaking. He was the one who had stood on the ceremonial rock and cast her aside like a worn-out cloak. He was the one who had announced his new betrothal while the wounds of her humiliation were still fresh. And now he stood here, claiming an ownership he himself had publicly renounced. The memory of his words from that night came rushing back, his voice dripping with condescending pity as he spoke of her unsuitability. He had broken her, or he had tried to. He had expected her to shatter into a million pieces, to become a ghost haunting the edges of the pack, a cautionary tale. He had not expected a rival alpha to see her as a weapon. A strange coldness began to spread through Alara's veins, starting from her heart and pushing out to her fingertips. It was a cold, clarifying calm. The last vestiges of sorrow, the phantom pains of a love she had mourned, began to recede. They were replaced by something hard and unyielding. Resolve. She looked at the man holding her arm, the man she had once promised her life to, and she felt nothing. The ghost was gone. The boy she had loved, the man she had believed in, had never really existed. There was only this angry, possessive, weak man, terrified that he had made a strategic miscalculation. He must have seen the change in her expression, the way her fear and shock were dissolving into something he could not read. His grip on her arm faltered for a fraction of a second. His approach was not working. So he changed tactics. It was a seamless shift, the kind of practiced manipulation she had seen him use on council members 100 times. The fury in his eyes was banked, replaced by a mask of strained concern. His voice softened, taking on a wheedling, almost pleading tone. "Alara, listen to me," he said, his thumb beginning to draw soothing circles on her arm, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt reptilian. "Don't be a fool. What do you think Damien Blackwood wants with you? He's our enemy. He'll use you and discard you. He'll break you in a way I never would." The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost dizzying. He spoke of breaking her as if he hadn't already tried his best to do exactly that in front of their entire world. He spoke of being used, as if that was not the very foundation of his new political alliance. He was projecting his own character onto Damien, painting the rival alpha with the colors of his own tainted soul. Alara's mind was sharp even now. She saw the move for what it was, a desperate attempt to frighten her back into her box, to make her believe that the cage he offered was safer than the frightening freedom of the unknown. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. He pressed on, his voice becoming more earnest, more persuasive. "You're one of us. Your place is here. I know things have been difficult. I know I hurt you." For a moment, a flicker of something that almost looked like regret crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. A performer's trick. "But this is madness. Don't throw your life away out of spite. It's beneath you." He was telling her what was beneath her. The man who had humiliated her for political gain, who had trampled on years of loyalty and affection without a second thought, was now lecturing her on dignity. The cold resolve inside her solidified into something as hard and sharp as obsidian. The last thread of connection, The final frayed strand of what they had once been finally snapped. It made no sound. It was just a quiet internal severing, a release, yawn. He leaned closer still, his breath warm against her cheek. The scent of him, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed foreign and invasive. Think about it, Alara. He whispered, his voice a conspiratorial caress. Stay. Behave. Show everyone that you're still loyal to this pack, to me, and I can still find a place for you. It won't be what it was, but I'll look after you. You won't be cast out. I promise. There it was, the offer, not of love, not of apology, not even of respect. It was an offer of patronage, a place as a favored pet, to be kept and cared for as long as she remained obedient, as long as she behaved. He was offering her a gilded cage, expecting her to be grateful for the shelter it provided. He truly did not see her. He never had. He had only ever seen a reflection of his own ambition, a tool to be used, and now a problem to be managed. The deep, aching hurt that had been her constant companion for weeks finally vanished, burned away by the clean, bright fire of this revelation. She felt no anger, no sadness, just a profound and complete emptiness where her love for him used to be. Her gaze did not waver from his. She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw him clearly. She saw the gaping insecurity he hid behind his arrogance. She saw the petty jealousy that drove him. She saw a man so desperate for power that he would destroy anything and anyone to get it, including himself. And she felt a sliver of something she never expected. Pity. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her other hand and placed it over his. His fingers tensed, perhaps expecting a struggle. But she did not struggle. She simply curled her fingers around his and lifted his hand from her arm. Her touch was cool and definite. She held his hand for a second longer, suspended in the air between them, before letting it go. It dropped to his side as if it had no life in it. She took a small step back, creating a space that felt as wide as a canyon. The skin on her arm tingled where he had held her, but the pain was already fading. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open, confusion warring with anger on his face. He had lost control of the conversation, of her, and he did not understand how. He was waiting for her to cry, to scream, to plead. He was waiting for the emotional, broken woman he thought he had created. He was not prepared for the quiet strength that now stood before him. Alara took a deep breath. The air no longer smelled of just pine and wood smoke. It smelled of freedom. She let the breath out slowly. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. It was not shaking. It was as calm and as clear as a winter morning. No, oh. The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. It was small, but its ripples were absolute. It was a complete sentence, a final statement. It was the end of a chapter, the end of a book, the end of an entire library of shared memories and broken promises. It was everything she needed to say. Reese looked as if she had struck him. His face went pale, then flushed with a dark, rising fury. No, he repeated, his voice cracking with disbelief. You can't say no to me. I am your future alpha. You are nothing to me, she said, her voice still quiet, but now imbued with a finality that cut through his blustering. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The truth was its own power. You have no claim on me, Reese, not anymore. For a long moment, he was utterly speechless. He just stared, his mind scrambling to catch up to a reality that had shifted completely without his permission. He had come here to put her back in her place, to reassert his dominance. Instead, he had handed her the very key to her own liberation. He had shown her the true nature of her prison, and in doing so had revealed that the door was never even locked. Alara did not wait for his response. There was nothing more to say. There was nothing more to hear. She turned her back on him. It was the hardest and easiest thing she had ever done. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from the anger that she could feel radiating from him like heat from a fire. But she did not run. She walked. Her back was straight. Her head was held high. Each step was deliberate, measured. She could feel his eyes boring into her back, a physical weight of impotent rage. She did not flinch. She did not look back. The path ahead of her, which just moments before had been a tangled mess of fear, duty, in confusion, now seemed to stretch out in a straight, clear line. The suffocating fog of her grief had lifted. The choice was no longer a torment, it was a destination. The whispers of the pack, the pitying glances, the weight of her father's sorrow, they were all still there, but they were behind her now. She walked away from the boy she thought she loved. She walked away from the life that had been stolen from her own. She walked away from the broken girl on the ceremonial stone. She walked towards the edge of the territory, towards the border creek, towards a man who had not offered her a cage but a seat at his side. She walked away from him without a backward glance, her path forward suddenly crystal clear. The finality of her decision left no room for the ghosts of the past. Walking away from Reese was not an act of escape. It was an act of deliberate, cold construction. Each step she took away from the council den was a brick being laid in the foundation of her new life. The air was sharp with the coming night, biting at her skin, but inside Alara felt a strange, clean burn. The humiliation and grief were still there, coils of smoke in a distant room of her heart. But the fire that now consumed her was one of purpose. She had been a piece in someone else's game for too long. Now she would set the board herself. She did not send a messenger. She did not wait for another summons. She simply walked, her path illuminated by a sliver of moon, heading directly for the border creek. This was not the same walk she had taken before, aimless and hollowed out by pain. Her stride was even, her senses alert. She heard the skittering of a field mouse in the undergrowth, smelled the damp earth and the rich scent of pine. Her world had not changed, but her place within it was about to. She was no longer a supplicant seeking refuge. She was a negotiator arriving to discuss the terms of an alliance. A peer. He was there, as she knew he would be. Damian Blackwood stood on the opposite bank, a dark, still silhouette against the paler gray of the forest behind him. He made no move as she approached, his stillness a form of power in itself. It was not a threatening stillness, but one of patient observation. He watched her come to a stop at the water's edge, the quiet rush of the creek the only sound between them for a long moment. She saw that he had come alone, a sign of respect, or a sign of supreme confidence, perhaps both. Alara did not wait for him to speak. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried across the water with perfect clarity, stripped of the tremor that had plagued it for weeks. "I have considered your offer, Alpha Blackwood." She met his intense gaze and held it, refusing to be the first to look away. This was the first test. She could feel it. She would not fail. "I accept it," she continued, "but not without conditions." A flicker of something moved in his dark eyes. It was not surprise. It was closer to approval. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, inviting her to continue. The gesture was small, but it ceded the floor to her completely. He was listening, truly listening. "My position," she began, her mind a fortress of carefully constructed points, "cannot be a quiet arrangement. It must be a formal title announced before your pack. Alpha's Council. I will not be a whisper in your court, a secret weapon you keep hidden away. My worth will be acknowledged publicly, or it will not be given at all." She paused, letting the weight of her first demand settle in the cold air. This was for her honor, for the name her father gave her. Damien's expression remained unreadable, but his focus on her was absolute. He seemed to be absorbing her words, not just hearing them. "Second," Alara went on, her resolve hardening with each sentence she spoke, "the alliance you offer my family must be ironclad. The lands of the Vance family are to be considered under Blackwood protection. They will be inviolable. No territorial challenges, no hunting route disputes, no political maneuvering from Reese Callan or his allies will be tolerated. My father's position as Alpha must be secure for as long as he chooses to hold it. I am not simply saving myself. I am protecting my bloodline." This was for her father, for the guilt that had been eating at her, the feeling of helplessness as she watched his strength falter. She took a breath, the cold air a balm to her racing heart. This final point was the most crucial. It was for herself, for the strategist who had been silenced for so long. "And third, my counsel is not to be mere suggestion. I will have access to all strategic meetings, all intelligence, All plans regarding the security and prosperity of the Blackwood Pack. When I give my advice, it will be given true weight. It will be debated, considered, and respected, even if it is ultimately rejected. I will not be a figurehead. I will be a partner in strategy. My mind is what you are buying, Alpha Blackwood. You must be prepared to use it. She finished, her chest tight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had laid her terms bare. There was no going back. She had demanded respect, security for her family, and genuine power. It was an audacious move for someone in her position, a woman publicly discarded and politically adrift. But she knew her own value. Damien had been the one to remind her of it, and she would not let him forget. She braced herself for negotiation, for him to push back, to try and whittle down her demands. Instead, silence stretched. Damien did not move for a long count of heartbeats. He simply watched her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He was looking past the defiant words, past the proud posture, and into the core of her. He was seeing the architect, the warrior, the woman who had clawed her way out of shame to stand before him as an equal. When he finally spoke, his deep voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "Your terms are not only accepted, Alara," he said, and the sound of her name from his lips was startlingly intimate. "They are what I expected." He took a step forward, right to the edge of the creek. A title without public acknowledgement is meaningless. An alliance that does not protect your family is an empty gesture. And a strategist who is not heard is a wasted asset. He paused. "I do not waste assets." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her knees weak. But she held herself straight, her expression betraying nothing of the storm inside her. He understood. He had not seen her demands as arrogance. He had seen them as the necessary price for a valuable alliance. He had seen her strength. With a fluid movement, Damien reached into a small leather pouch at his belt. He drew something out, holding it in his closed fist. "A pack like this requires a token," he said, his voice softer now. "A symbol of the agreement. Silver is the metal of your pack. It is the metal of promises that were broken." As he spoke, he stepped onto the smooth, wet stones lining the creek bed, crossing the narrow channel of water that separated their territories. He was closing the distance, entering her lands without an invitation. But it did not feel like an invasion. It felt like the conclusion of a treaty. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body in the cool night air. She had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. He was taller and broader than she had realized. His presence was immense, a mountain of quiet power. He smelled of pine and cold stone and something else, something uniquely his own, wild and clean. He opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a piece of night made solid. It was an arrowhead carved from gleaming black obsidian. It was flawless, its edges lethally sharp, its surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the pale moonlight. It was beautiful and dangerous. It was a perfect representation of him, of his pack. "This is a token of the Blackwood Pack," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "It is direct, it is sharp, it is unyielding. It will not tarnish, and it will not break." He reached for her hand. His fingers were long and warm as they gently pried her clenched fist open. His touch was surprisingly careful, a stark contrast to the brutal grip Reese had used on her arm. He placed the obsidian arrowhead into her open palm. The stone was cool and smooth against her skin, its weight a solid, tangible reality. It was a promise, a weapon, a new beginning. As he placed the arrowhead in her hand, his fingers brushed against her palm, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The touch was brief, a whisper of contact, but a jolt of unexpected warmth shot up her arm, straight to her chest. It was an electric current that made her heart skip a beat. It was connection, a spark of life in the frozen landscape of her soul. In that single fleeting moment, surrounded by the cold and the dark, Alara felt a warmth she had thought she would never feel again. The air in the Moonstone clearing was thick with unspoken words. It clung to the ancient oaks and settled like a heavy mist over the assembled Silver Moon pack. This was the first full moon gathering since Reese had shattered Alara's world on this very spot. Tonight, the tension was a living thing, a predator stalking the edges of the crowd. Every eye was on the ceremonial rock where her father, Alaric, stood with a weary sort of dignity. Rhys was beside him, his arm around his new mate, a picture of smug triumph. Elara stood apart from her family, a solitary figure near the edge of the circle. In the pocket of her tunic, her fingers traced the sharp, cold edges of the obsidian arrowhead. It felt real, a promise of a future. In her other hand, hidden in her palm, the silver locket felt like a smooth, dead stone. A hush fell as Alaric prepared to speak, but before he could begin, Elara moved. She walked forward, her steps measured and deliberate. A murmur rippled through the pack. Her father's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and pride. Rhys watched her approach, a flicker of annoyance crossing his handsome face, as if her presence was an inconvenience he had to endure. She did not look at him. She looked at the faces of the pack, the people she had grown up with, the ones who had whispered about her, and the ones who had offered silent pity. Her gaze swept over them all, clear and unwavering, before finally resting on her father. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a reassurance and a farewell. She stepped onto the flat granite rock, the same stone where she had stood frozen in humiliation. This time there was no tremor in her legs. She felt the cool, solid surface beneath her feet. The collective breath of the pack was a soft, waiting sound in the twilight. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud. It was perfectly clear and carried to the farthest edges of the clearing. "I stand before you one last time as a daughter of the Silver Moon Pack," she began. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Rhys's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Weeks ago, on this stone, a bond was broken," Elara continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "It was said that I was unsuitable, that my worth was insufficient for the future of this pack." She let the words hang in the air, a direct echo of Rhys's cruelty. She saw him flinch. "I have come to understand that my path does not lie here, among those who measure a person's value by their mate." Her eyes found Rhys, and for the first time, she truly looked at him. She felt no pain, no lingering love, only a profound and distant pity for the smallness of his ambition. He was staring at her, his face a mask of disbelief turning to rage. He had expected her to be broken, to fade into the background. He had never expected this defiance. "An offer was made to me," she announced, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "An alliance founded not on sentiment, but on strategy and mutual respect." A wave of confused whispers swept through the crowd. Her father stood straighter, his face a canvas of complex emotion. "The alpha of the Blackwood Pack has seen my worth." A collective gasp echoed through the clearing. The name of their historic rival spoken aloud on the ceremonial rock was a shock that sent tremors through the pack's very foundation. Rhys looked as if she had struck him. His new mate shrunk away from him slightly, her eyes wide with alarm. The political implications were immediate and catastrophic for him. "I have accepted his offer," Elara declared, her voice cutting through the rising chaos. "I will serve the Blackwood Pack as Alpha's counsel, his chief strategist." She let them absorb the title, the power it held. She was not a refugee seeking shelter. She was a weapon being unsheathed by a rival's hand. "This alliance will ensure the Vance family and their lands remain inviolable. My father's position will be secured not by the grace of Hit Beta heir, but by the strength of a new, and powerful ally." She saw the dawning comprehension on the faces of Rhys's supporters. They had backed a man who had just been spectacularly outmaneuvered. Then she opened her hand. The silver locket lay gleaming on her palm, catching the last rays of the setting sun. It was the symbol of a broken promise, of a hollow love. For a moment she looked at it, remembering the girl who had received it with a heart full of hope. That girl was gone. With a quiet finality, she let the locket fall from her fingers. It hit the granite rock with a small, metallic click that sounded as loud as a thunderclap in the stunned silence. The crescent moon lay tarnished on the stone, a discarded piece of a forgotten story. She did not spare it a second glance. Without another word, Elara turned her back on the rock, on Rhys, and on the entire Silver Moon Pack. She stepped down from the stone and began to walk. The crowd parted for her as if she were a ghost, their faces a blur of shock, fear, and a dawning grudging respect. She could feel Reese's furious gaze burning into her back, but she did not falter. Her focus was on the tree line at the edge of the territory, the border she was about to cross. Her heart ached for her father, for the home she was leaving behind. She could feel his sorrow reaching for her, a tangible thing. But this was the only way to save him, to save herself. Each step was a severing, a painful but necessary cut from the past. The sounds of the clearing faded behind her, replaced by the sound of her own steady breathing and the whisper of the wind in the pines ahead. As she drew closer to the border creek, she saw him. Damian Blackwood was not hiding in the shadows. He stood openly on his side of the territory, a tall, commanding figure against the darkening sky. He was alone, his presence a silent statement of confidence. He had trusted her to come. He had trusted her to do this on her own terms. He watched her approach, his dark eyes intense and unreadable. But she saw no pity in them. She saw only recognition. He saw the strategist who had just redrawn the political map of the region. He saw the woman who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. She reached the edge of the creek, the gurgling water the only sound between them. This small stream was the line between her old life and her new one. On one side was humiliation and heartache. On the other was an unknown future, a dangerous path, but one she had chosen. A profound, unspoken understanding passed between them in that moment. It was a look that acknowledged the weight of her sacrifice, the depth of her courage, and the sharp intelligence of her move. It was a look of pure, undiluted respect. In his eyes, she was not a discarded mate. She was an equal. She was his alpha's counsel. She took a breath, the crisp, cool air of the Obsidian Ridge territory filling her lungs, smelling of cold stone and wild things. Then she stepped into the creek, the cold water swirling around her ankles. It felt like a baptism, washing away the last vestiges of her old life. As she reached the other side and stepped onto Blackwood land, Damien offered her his hand. It was not a gesture of possession or control. It was an invitation, a sign of partnership. His hand was large and warm, his grip firm and steady. The moment her fingers closed around his, a sense of profound calm settled over her. For the first time in months, Alara felt the ground solid beneath her feet. His hand was warm, steady, an anchor in a world that had just shifted. Alara's fingers curled around his as she crossed the shallow creek. Cold water soaked her boots, a shock that seemed to wash away the last remnants of the Silver Moonlands. The air here was different. It smelled of wet stone and crushed pine, something wilder and sharper. This was the Obsidian Ridge, Damian Blackwood's territory. They walked in a strange, comfortable quiet up the path that wound through ancient trees. She had expected to feel like a prisoner, but the constant calculations in her mind had ceased. There was only the crunch of their boots and the solid presence of the man walking beside her. The path opened into a vast amphitheater of dark, terraced stone. Dozens of figures were gathered there, their faces turned toward them. The Blackwood pack. Their gazes were like chips of flint, hard and assessing. Alara felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. It was another crowd waiting to judge her, to find her wanting. Her hand instinctively went to the obsidian arrowhead in her pocket. Its sharp edges were a grounding force, a reminder of the pact she had made. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, meeting their stares. Damien stopped at the center of the highest terrace, turning to face his pack. Alara stood at his side. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and their suspicion of the Silver Moon Wolf in their midst. What was she? A prize? A traitor? When Damien finally spoke, his voice was calm, carrying to every corner. "This is Alara Vance," he said, his words clear and direct. "She is my alpha's counsel. She will speak with my voice, and her word will be honored as my own." The statement was simple, absolute. He offered no explanation. He did not present her as someone to be pitied, but as an extension of his own power. A murmur rippled through the assembled pack. It was not a sound of welcome, but of grudging acceptance. They were a pack forged in discipline. They might not understand their alpha's decision, but they would respect it. Alara watched an older woman with silver threaded through her hair give a slow, deliberate nod. The nod was for Damien, a confirmation of his command. Alara understood. Her place here was not given freely. It would have to be earned. When the gathering was dismissed, Damien turned to her. There is one more place I wish to show you. He led her up a steep, winding path that clung to the side of the mountain. Finally, they reached the summit. A flat, windswept peak of black rock offered an unbroken view of the entire territory. Ilara gasped. The obsidian ridge was a stark and brutal kind of beautiful. Jagged peaks clawed at the sky, their slopes dark with pine and shadow. A silver river cut through the landscape like a vein of liquid moonlight. Far in the distance, she could just make out the softer, greener hills of the world she had left behind. Damien came to stand beside her, so close their shoulders almost touched. Reese saw a pasture, he said, his voice a low rumble. He wanted to be the biggest ram in a small field. He gestured out at the wild domain before them. I prefer to run with wolves in the mountains. Ilara finally understood the core difference between the two men. Reese craved the adoration of a comfortable crowd. Damien commanded the respect of a pack that thrived in a harsh world. Your pack is wary of me, she said, the words carried away by the wind. They should be, he answered, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Respect is not given here, Ilara. It is forged. They will test you. A shiver ran through her, but it was not from the cold. It was the thrill of anticipation. And when they do, she asked. He finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes intense. Show them why I chose you, he said simply. Show them the strategist that I saw when no one else was looking. His belief in her was a physical force, settling into her bones and mending the fractures left by Reese's cruelty. The humiliation of that night on the ceremonial rock felt like a story about someone else, a lifetime ago. The pain and shame had been burned away, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. This was her new board. These were her new pieces. For the first time, she was not a hidden weapon, but a queen in her own right, standing beside her king. She felt the arrowhead in her pocket, a cool token of a pact made not of sentiment, but of mutual strength. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. It felt like the first true breath she had taken in months. The knot of grief she had carried for so long, a cold, heavy stone, finally dissolved. In its place, a warmth spread, a thrilling promise of what was to come. She was home.